So we're covering the preamble part 1 and then chapter 1. And I can share this if anybody's interested in my current copy of the PDF. But yeah, so reading down through it, this first chapter is going to be about the 4 first principles, and that's the business of what we're going to try and get done here. Review those, and I think a lot of opportunities to sort of have discussions about those. Oops, let me figure out a little bit better on my mouse handling here. Okay, all right. So let's see. So, but just by the way, on this comment down here, where Zhamak says, it's arguably still in the innovator early adopter phase of the innovation adoption curve. Gartner came under a lot of heat in November when they dismissed DataMesh as it's never going to get to a plateau. It's going to fizzle and fade because it's just a noise and data fabric is where people should focus. And there were a lot of comments about that. I don't think I haven't seen a sort of an update on that. But in this innovator thing, as I say, it was interesting to read that Gartner initially said, yeah, we don't even think it's going to get all the way up to implementation and plateau and on the trough of disillusionment curve. But I think we're all evidence to the contrary that it is having a big impact, and it's certainly getting a critical mass. We're in a sense the early innovators here. So let's see. Let's move on to. I think we're going to go right into chapter 1 after this. Scroll down a bit. Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. So I like the idea that if this book in large sense is a lot of architecture. We're going to talk about the 4 first principles. So I like her use of quotes at the beginning of things. We'll see the Thomas Kahn sort of what happens in a disruption. But in this case, we've got an actual architect telling us to think about the simple things. Now, the opening sentence, I looked at that socio-technical approach, and I'm waiting to see some meat around what is the socio? Is it just a new way we're going to think about enterprise organization and how that links within technical? But that was something I'm sort of waiting to tease out. Now, did anybody have an approach or a thought on because it's pretty powerful. I mean, the decentralization, I think we get that from the prologue, what's going to be going on there. We're expecting complex and large scale environments. And we've kind of talked a little bit about how a pervasive IT infrastructure that's effective would mirror the organizational structure. So that's why I'm sort of thinking, just others. What did anybody have any sort of thoughts on this particular term, socio-technical?
I do. I actually don't like it. I think it's sort of jargonish, and I think it is a word that is unnecessarily vague, and I think it just really means that it requires a shift in organizational mindset. So it's a shorthand. The way I read it is it's a shorthand for people have to be educated to think differently, which, my way of talking about software has always been people build software for people. And I've heard this in a lot of conferences, the socio-technical context of the blah, blah. And I just think, it just means people need to think differently. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I was, and I highlight this because it's like, all right, I'll give you a pass on it for now, but I'm going to want to see, does this pop up and make sense later? Because right now, to me, it also felt like a jargon in search of more definition around it, if it's not just jargon. There's another thing that I picked up on this first page here too, is I think we're going to see a tension between analytical data and operational data. It's going to come up here in a minute, but I think we're all kind of used to the idea that analytical data, we like to think, well, that's got value because it reveals trends. We can see correlations. It's not, transactional in nature. I want to sort of, pull this up because in the next later on, she's going to sort of call out, well, here's what I mean by analytical, but here's what I mean by data. So my impression was on this note here, it's a little early to sort of say, look, if I say data, I always mean analytical, because we're gonna wind up. I think it forces her to sometimes introduce. No, I'm talking about operational data now. So it's kind of like electric versus acoustical guitar, right? We only need one word guitar until electric came along, and then we had to start saying, oh, I'm talking about acoustic or electrical, and probably mostly assume electrical now. But I think there's that tension that's going to go on too here, and when do we use one versus the other, and the data domain is going to own them all or both of them, but how they put these together, she's going to favor the product is most likely analytical. And also, any thoughts, comments there? Others, how did you read this one?
I have one that I actually don't like the early distinction as well. And my thesis on all the tension that I've felt implementing analytical systems is that we make this differentiation too early and too often as we're building analytical systems. Like, oh, it doesn't work that way because it's an analytical system. That's like works another way, right? Like, I think and it starts here, but I think it's also toned throughout the book. There is like this very stark, almost unexplained differentiation between like operational data and analytic data. And I think of all the things that I like, and this is like the first start of it, that was one thing that I didn't like, because my thesis generally on analytical systems is the more that we can like integrate them into the system, the more things start becoming, working, with less friction and become more functional in an organization. So I don't know. I'll stop there, but I don't like this term and this differentiation, this stark differentiation, and it appears pretty early without context. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, I'll add another, which is, in the context of machine learning, it's often machine learning is going to rely on massive amounts of operational data to find correlations. In effect, it's almost like the analytical has a higher value plane, even when it's like the data domain producers are going to worry about, hey, we've got masses of inputs potentially, and when we finally formalize these into a catalog and a data product, in a sense, we're amalgamating a lot to then abstract it to a simple, and we call that analytic data because it represents the process we went to get it to have concentrated value, as opposed to having to go through the raw all the time.
Well, it's interesting. I think this actually reflects old thinking. This reflects OLAP and OLTP, and it kind of ignores event-driven data architectures. And I see that as problematic as well, because as was discussed here, there is not increasingly this hard line, because and actually in the products the vendors are building, they're building raw zones and curated zones. Yeah, and exactly. So and so again, I think this just, we all have it. We have to overcome, even the author, we have to overcome our where we came from, which was that hard line where you'd have OLTP, you do your ETL, and then you'd have OLAP. And I think that we need to blur that line.
Yeah, and she will come up in the next couple of pages and explicitly say operational is OLTP and analytical is OLAP. The other echo that I heard in that was when I was teaching, designing this class that then I'm teaching just to the one student right now. We started with Alex Gorlick's the big data enterprise lake. So you got big data and data lake all in there. But he sort of called out that his struggle was with all these operations team that presented the data warehouse as the be all end all, and then he gets to the architecture that the raw, the curated, or the raw, the cleansed, the curated, as a way of saying, yeah, the data warehouse can't really do that because it is in itself its own little monolith. But yeah, so it's and I think that's to my mind that's the struggle I was having. Look, if you go all the way to OLAP, aren't you starting to sort of define a technology almost? And you know sure, the data domain units can each pick what it is that they want. But yeah, that's others, or I'll move on. All right, let's see. So now we're going to get into.
I think Varsha had a comment.
Oh, Marcia, yeah. Please just jump in because I can only see the screen I'm sharing now.
I was allowing you to complete your because when thoughts do come, there's a flow. I cannot stop. So what I was just going through a couple of videos and even her video. So what she says is typically, I mean, in terms of today, when we are moving from monolithic to the microservices kind of concept in every area, she's asking us to go back to the monolithic way, like decentralizing. And then what she's suggesting that every area is just going to comprise its own data. And then anyways, we are going to apply the basic rule as in typically collecting the data, ETL, and then analytics. So ultimately, this is the base rule. That's what Lynn was just saying. She's just saying the same thing, and she's saying we can apply in different small data marts. So when she says is data mesh, and then it has to break down the lake in that area, and then it is more easy and applicable. But somewhere we are still close to the baseline of database itself, what it was long back. Again, the same thing, transaction, ETL, OLAP. There is no difference in it. So, I mean, going back, still the rule to combine everything is same. Now, what I understood, the way she was representing is, if we put it in different small section of data, as she was just trying to break it down, we still do have to link it for the different usage. She's saying that different users would be connected there. But ultimately, data is just at one end. However, we are guarding it. We are splitting it. So, I mean, going back to the same way, just in a different organization of data. There, she's not taking it to, I mean, as per my understanding, until today, what I read, what I have gone through with the database, her presentation was there on the YouTube, and someone was already there onto the link too. To post it there. So she's just splitting up. She's asking to do the same. The only thing is the audience for every data set is different. That's what she's saying. And now she's asking the same way Lynn was saying, asking the business people to rethink. It's more like a reverse engineering. How feasible is that? Because we are already halfway somewhere. I know it could happen. I mean, if somebody will start thinking in this way today, probably after 3-4 years later, we might have some like-minded people, and we have a bunch of people to think about it in this way, other way around. But today, the problem is right now today when we have bulk of data out of everything into the online season. So we need something to do and probably start somewhere today, so that in just coming year or somewhere we have something very stable to deal with it. Probably just going back to re-engineer and do something onto this. Because if you ask me to rethink in this way, I would take time to understand how would I represent my whole lot of data of this complete organization in this way. When I think of how much time would it consume? And time plays a lot big matter here, because every day we have bulk of data, be it useful or not, it doesn't matter. I mean, we would definitely make it useful down the line or whatever way. But today we have, So time is a good decision maker here too. We should consider that too. Just not, it's fine to represent a structure. It's good to present something, but today the world is pretty much here. What we see, the criticality is we should do something in a quicker manner. It is, easy, quick, and I would say, just a thought probably, if we can think of the database side too, taking it into the microservices kind of concept,
Mhm.
just not taking as a big one. Idea in a splitting small sections is a good thing. Definitely, it's more manageable, easy to govern. Everything is a lot better when you put it into the section. It's categorized. That's what we were discussing in the last section too. In a big whole thing, if I take it as a big one, it is definitely challenging because we are managing many people at one source. Now she's saying, the video which I was just referring, she's saying, now source has to take to the audience. She means everything is coming into the data lake. Now data lake is to be presenting in a different source. That's what the typical concept of our data warehouse typically, producing the reports for the different sections of the management, different area. But it should be something where more implementable. We should think of something in this way, where maybe we should get some line to think of, so that like after 4 or 5 months or 6 months down the size, we should think of something where we can implement and get the results out of it. That's what I think right now.
Yeah, that raises a contrast that I called out in the notes too. Is, well, a couple things to think about. How small can a unit be and be a data domain unit? Because in the Duff example, there are clearly sort of business drivers and specialty business value and what those groups are doing. And the other, so that's one question I'm sort of watching through this is, okay, I understand what a data domain does, but how big, how small can it be? And then the other thing is to continually sort of poke at the contrast between a data lake, where we initially said, hey, break down silos, put it in the lake, everybody can share. Keep pulling in that tension of where is DataMesh doing something very different. And I have some opinions on that, but let's move on to in the page then, and on the outcomes now. Again, I looked at these three, and it was sort of like, well, isn't responding gracefully to change the definition of agility? So if I look at this again and said, okay, we need agility for business essential complexity, got that, and then I think then I can take the second bullet point to say, how do you keep being agile even if you were growing? And I liked on that YouTube video where they were talking about the healthcare company, and their growing was lots of acquisition. And so it felt like DataMesh was going to help them, in effect, create, as they acquired a new company, they could break it out into its business pieces and say, okay, let's set you up for DataMesh so we can figure out how to govern and include all that. And on the increase the ratio value from data to investment, I think that's going to be a measure of success for the outcome, which probably organizations will track to, because the easy way to do some of this might be start with something very specific, apply the data mesh to that organizational unit that everybody wants to borrow from, see their data, and then see how you begin expanding the governance if you can get a piece of it right.
But that's more like, I'm sorry.
No, go. Yeah.
It's more like, again, educating the business people about why we want this shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how easy would it be. Technical person would understand, because they are dealing with daily problems. Business will typically see the the forecast by using such technology, some shift. What shift do they see in their business and their outcomes? That's what when she says we have to educate to business people, that is there.
Yeah, and related to that, there's another. So right now, she breaks it up into, from the Duff example. Okay, look, we've got these particular business domains, but there's another way to think about this, which is there may be data. Well, let me just offer another dimension. We have a lot of data platform tools, right? It used to be only SQL. We had no SQL. We had key value pairs. We had document databases. We're getting graph databases for recommender engines. That's another way to look at, are there some data domains that essentially align themselves well to particular kinds of platforms, and because the platforms in some way align to different sort of outcomes in businesses. That's another way that an organization might look at this and say, oh my gosh, we have a horrible recommender engine. What are we going to do about it? Let's go set up a data domain unit focused on the business problem of recommender engines, and then they can define, this is all the operational data that we're going to need from all these other pieces of the business and maybe third parties to be able to give that kind of results to the business organizations that want something like that. That would be another way to start with, rather than just the acquisition process.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting use case. Like, I think where I've kind of championed a form of this, more in the form of event-driven design. It's been around, like you start with the problems, right? You start where there's impedance, where like maybe data was a tailpipe, but it's also an important asset, maybe even for like operational systems. You mentioned like an ML algorithm. Most of those end in, some sort of user experience or some sort of like functional requirement of an application, right? So like, I think there's definitely places to start where it's a higher concern, right? Like the places where the data is more volatile, perhaps where there is immaturity in like kind of data production, data collection. And then that might mesh out, right? Like, because we have input ports that we need to satisfy, and maybe that creates a requirement for another team to, kind of drive adoption. So I think that's definitely an interesting way to think about it outside of like an acquisition. I actually think an acquisition would be hard, perhaps because, we've all been through those.
Yeah.
The amount of change management to like adopting like a new pattern, even if it might be beneficial to the actual kind of synthesis of the new organization, would be pretty severe, I think.
Well, and that was like the business problem that team was facing as well. And they didn't start out saying data mesh, right? They came to a point where it was broken, and this seemed like, okay, we've got to rethink how we're doing this. But the other challenge too with companies who, to my mind, who are focused on acquisitions is they're good at it because they have processes, right? After you've done 2 or 3 of them, it's like, yeah, here's how we go in, we evaluate, we decide, yep, here's where we think the easy points are going to be and the hard points are going to be. But it seemed like, yeah, in the YouTube, their problem was, yeah, we tried that and we were just getting too many, and we needed an architecture around it. But
yeah, it's interesting.
I like what she did here in a sense of, what does the before and after look like? Because this could be one way to start identifying, okay, if an organization, which of these feels like a pain point? I've seen the pain point really come down to with the data lakes. How do you get to a layer above data lakes to be able to do governance very well? Yeah, so it could be like, if the thing you're looking for is anybody who has more than a dozen data lakes. Yeah, they have a problem. This is a very appealing. Okay, if we could start we've got to think of each of those data lakes. Why do you create them? Well, we had a business problem we were trying to solve. Okay, that sounds like a data domain. We got some processes set up for how we do that. Okay, good. That's internal. What's your catalog look like, so that we could then say, okay, here's the person who can give access, and here are the consumers who want it. Let's see. So now I think we have a picture. Another thing that, did anybody notice too, if you bought the book, that it's all in grays and everything, and then we get to anything electronic and we get gorgeous color? I find it a little frustrating because I read the book and it's like, oh, wow, it looks so much prettier. But yeah, just nice diagrams. And the one that I sort of latched onto was the top one was really, where she started in one of the I think her first YouTube or the first conference presentation, where she pulled up Khan's problem of what's it called, a scientific what's a paradigm change. That's right. And she focused on, when we've seen how badly 3-tier architectures go with web, middleware, and database. That's what we're in a sense creating, is the people in the middle have to do all the work, and they have a hard time understanding either end of it. So that looked like I like that one because it's a high level summarizes, what is the pain point. Well, you can't scale it if the people in the middle just can't keep up with the demand on either side of it.
Yeah.
Did anybody else have favorites on this one, or one they said, oh yeah, that's the one I
think the organizational, like kind of the decentralized ownership. Could you scroll down a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I think the principally, the data as a product, those two things kind of resonated. But I think like, we've all built central teams and realized it was a mistake, right? Or executed centrally because it was easiest, or the organization, that was the only way to do it within an organization. There's just 3 or 4 people who were experts, right? Who had the technical and domain knowledge to do it, but we all know it doesn't scale at all. So yeah, I think the organizational part of decentralized a decentralized org, and then kind of data as a product and kind of sharing and connecting is, I think, one of the big ideas, obviously.
It's interesting, the focus on domain-driven design, which is not a new concept in software architecture, but it is a new concept in data.
Absolutely.
So one of the talks that she gave was at a DDD conference in Berlin, Germany, called Kandinsky, that I actually spoke at one time. So I'm familiar with that group as well. And it's interesting taking that paradigm from building applications and trying to apply it here, because that was kind of a moment for me when I really thought about that. Because I have, probably all do, experience in DDD applications. I just hadn't thought of it in terms of as a solution to data swamp, basically, which is what she's going for.
I felt there was always a connection, right? Kind of like even with classic Kimball-esque data warehousing, in terms of like domains and like the unit of execution, but obviously it was with a centralized model, so it didn't really work. But I think it comes alive when you think about it in the context of a decentralized model, which is how you execute domain-driven design in a microservice or event-driven architecture, right? So,
right. And the other thing I keep coming back to is we've all built data marts because they made data warehouses work better, right?
Yeah.
And so I keep saying when I read this book, how is this different from a data mart? I have to challenge myself, because that's my, I have to go back to beginner's mind, basically, because that's my basis for comparison. One of the things on this page that helps me with that is data and code as a unit, because I get that in terms of domain-driven design. I don't know if I quite get that for data as a product. I think it's a great idea. I'm struggling with the practicality of it, what it actually looks like.
Yeah, I agree. It's a little abstract, and I don't think it becomes much clearer as we read on as well. if we're thinking the data is integral to the code of the functioning domain, right? Like, as you know, imagine that service, that person service, and like kind of the production of, let's stick with her differentiation, analytic data, as being part of that code and part of the responsibility of that code. I kind of dig it. We don't get to it yet, I don't think, and I don't know if it was ever made particularly clear, but that makes sense to me, right? And that's the data product ownership, right? That team also owns the analytic, you know, kind of data sets and outputs, right?
Just real quick, two things that I thought of, and I'm only about 3 or 4 chapters into the book, so. But yeah, so we're seeing this in DevOps all the time too. So that's, I mean, DevOps, the term has only been around for about 10 years, but this is exactly where they're going. Instead of having a monolithic development team, you are breaking up small teams and they're working directly with the business. And so, you know, domain-driven design and all that stuff is great, but at least in my experience, it was always, let's carve up the business into the specific domains, but who's doing that carving up? It's still the developers, right? And at least the things I've been involved with, the stakeholders, as far as the business people, they were the end customer of whatever the developers developed, but they weren't really integrated. And you didn't have these small units who were owning that product. It was, you throw it over the wall. The business people either liked it or didn't. They tweaked changes, but it was still hidden behind that barrier of the developers, the database admins, and things like that. So, and then even internally, your developers, they didn't talk to each other. They didn't talk to the database. Depending on how big your teams were, you had the mainframe guys, you had the new, you know, online microservices guys, you've got the SQL guys who you're not allowed to touch our database without our indexing rules. You know, there were all these barriers. And so the idea that you've got your you're not allowed to have a development team that's larger than 2, that can't be fed with more than 2 pizzas. If you've heard that, the idea is you've got your developer, you've got your architect, you've got your engineer, you've got your business person, you've got your security guy, you got your tester, and they're all in the same group, and they're splintering off, solving these niche problems. And you know, so I love that first graphic. And then part of the data as a product that kind of goes together for me, thinking this way, because our problem in our department anyway, in our organization, is everybody creates data, but IT is the gatekeeper, because we're the ones that have the developers, we're the ones that have the report creators. And so what happens is whenever anyone wants a new report, they come to IT, and we're just saturated with work. We don't understand the domain, so it's this back and forth. What do you want it to look like? Where you should have, what metrics are you looking at? We carve it up in domains for like HR or fiscal, but we don't understand the fundamentals. So it's a lot of back and forth. Report gets created, it sits for 6 months. Someone else wants access to it. Who do they ask? They ask IT. Well, we don't know the data governance, you know. Now we have to go to ask HR, is it okay for payroll to have access to these fields of data? Why are we mediating that conversation? And so I like the idea that we have these small little teams. HR owns their data. Maybe we bring in a little bit of expertise for the operation side, wherever it's located, whatever we call this, the data mart, the servers, the cloud, whatever, IT, we make sure all that works. But HR, they're the ones designing their own reports. Maybe we start training them in reporting tools, but it's a lot more fluid. It's a lot more flexible. They can, as long as we set up the permissions correctly, they can go to town creating reports. We'll assist here and there, depending on how big the team is, depending on what we can embed in HR, but they have their own data people. And then they're the ones, it sounds like from her book, I don't think the structure exists yet, but it sounds like for data governance, it's also HR saying, oh, here are the roles of people that have access to these things of data. And it's done at a surface level where, I don't know, again, we create these reports, we have this underlying data that's being sourced on. If you're in payroll and I say you're allowed to have these data, it automatically all works. It's not someone diving way back down into the SQL code or permissions to say this role has this row level access. I think that's way too much in the weeds. And I think that, at least that spoke to me. It sounds like that's where she's going. Let's put the data as a product back in HR's hands. Let them own the product. Let them, because they have all the knowledge and we'll facilitate. But heck, if I could embed a few data engineers into each one of my departments, let them be the experts and go to town. That's where I see this flexible, this idea going. And honestly, until she said it, like you mentioned, Lynn, it's a concept that's been around forever. It's making great headway on the development side right now with all these nimble, flexible development teams. I just have never thought about it with data before, and I'm looking back over our SQL servers and these massive terabytes of data, and who owns it all? It's all IT. I don't want to own any of that stuff. And so that's what really spoke to me. So yeah, I see that's where she's going, and
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking when she was talking about the decentralization. Similar thing came into my mind, the way Matt has just thinking about the department-wise thing. The only thing is, then there would be a lot more databases. Then there would be another thought of to link it together. Then somebody would be owning all of them, not individual. Somebody has to take care of the whole database, and it is interlinked because you don't know what demands come. We should be linking in like all HR, payroll or whatever databases are linked together. I mean, I'm just thinking decentralized, but is still connected. Then only it's sufficing.
So the cloud products are being built that way. So I've looked at both GCP Dataplex, and then a big announcement this week was AWS Data Zone was announced, and they're built to create these planes or areas where you can link different data artifacts. Their foundational is buckets, because the thinking is kind of beyond relational databases here. But like in Google, it's BigQuery data sets. And I haven't dug into the Amazon, but you can do pub substreams. You can put any of these kind of artifacts. And that's where that picture of the federated computational governments, the cloud vendors are actually building this, where you assign the permissions by roles at the group of data artifacts based on the business domain. The challenge, because I'm actually building a prototype, as we've been saying, is this is a very new way of thinking for the business.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what I'm finding is that, we're going to have reference architectures, because the business it's too abstract, right? And in like my case is I've got genomics, and so none of the reference architectures are reflecting that, because it's more reflecting kind of a e-commerce, more traditional kind of thing. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is how can I work with a group of people to build reference architecture for the vertical in general. Because what's interesting about the vertical is we have the highest volumes of data by far. Like, there's no comparison. And we also, and this has been accelerated by COVID, have unprecedented demand for data sharing. For example, I'm involved in a project right now funded by the National Institute of Health in the United States. And the idea is to have 5 participating groups, whether it's universities or hospitals or whatever, build stratified data sets around genomic information. Because one of the things that we learned during COVID is that our reference data sets really need to be more complete, because they focus basically on US and European white people, mostly men. And as we know, genomics are, differ for different places. And so it impacts human health. And so there's been this escalation into building these data sets by pulling the data together from the organizations. So this is like a literal actual project I'm working on that seems very relevant to this. And I think the result of it will be that the patterns derived by genomics, because of the data volumes, will be applicable. Because before it was always the e-commerce example, but I think it's going to start to be the health example, because we're going faster now. So the other thing I want to mention is I really want to put in people's minds, because I worked a bazillion years in relational. but my last 7 years have been in genomics. I haven't seen a relational database in 7 years. So where we're going
That blows my
is we're going beyond relational because of the data volumes. And so that's sort of, I think, foundational here. It's sort of an underlying thing. She never really mentions it, but the foundational thing is data lakes here, which is buckets.
You know,
Yeah. Oh,
I-
go ahead.
no, I agree with that. And I think, another pattern, going back to like event-driven architecture and domain-driven design, which seems to resonate in terms of the solution set is also like the concept of a local read model, right? Like applications and microservice environments build those all the time. So one interpretation or like guess at the future state, or maybe it's part of it, not all of it, is, people building out these, I'll put up the quotes again, analytic, local read models, for their purpose, right? So might be cases that you don't need like this plugged in world where everything talks to everything. Like, some cases might be more narrow, more bespoke, thinking about that recommendation algorithm or, some product insights use case, right? So, but I definitely feel relationals, not very useful for most of these solutions, but it could for a small, local read model, right?
Yeah, no, and there's just to tag a little bit on the challenge. So that I see with data lakes, right, is the hard part is they tend to be close to an all or nothing access. So remember, we went to data lakes. The big push was if we could break down data silos and get all these business units to put their data in a central place. Oh my God, the value we could discover. But it had that premise of it was very hard to restrict things. We could start going down to rows, which got to be very tedious, but for centralized data. But what I see sort of happening now in this federated model is, well, it's good if you wound up giving everybody wide access to a data set and lots of different ways to do querying. But then at the federated level, you're going to have to be able to say these things, but not those things. So in a sense, your lower level, the security is probably going to be fairly wide because any restriction it has automatically follows up to the level above it. And then but the level above it, when we say a data producer, they've got to be able to say, yeah, here are my broad swaths of things that I know people want. And then maybe instead of having 30 things at the data lake level in terms of security objects, maybe I only have 5 when I get up to my my data platform that I'm going to put out here. Yeah, let's. In the interest of let's get down then and start talking about the principles. And she says that the order of the principles are important because they are going to sort of feed on the other. And I think her diagram does a good job of sort of explaining how she sees the relevance of each of these versus each other. But so the top one is, in a sense, we've got to figure out, okay, back to an organization has a lot of data. Maybe they do sort of have centralized monoliths of how that data is being processed right now. But that business unit is going to be, if we use the HR model, yeah, here's the kinds of data I have. Here's the things that I can usefully produce for other parts of the business, projections of employees most likely to leave, how do we manage effective management and impact on retention and things like that. But then that business unit, if we start to say, okay, look, great, you're great at, to extend the HR model. You're great at hiring people and giving them benefits and trying to have that not be the reason they leave. But wouldn't it be nice if you gave us these kinds of broader analytics? So now HR has a product to think about that because on their own they might not come up with a product, right?
That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges with this is this idea of decentralized ownership, where you're actually saying to these organizations, which you just described, is you now have to care about data, right? You have a non-functional requirement that you need to care about, right? That you never had to care about, and you have to budget accordingly, right? And I think, you know, if you think about the other buckets of like non-functional requirements, let's say like tech debt, or, you know, which could have resiliency, scalability, cleaning up old code or whatever. Now, you know, how often is that prioritized, right? As a versus functional requirements.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think makes it a little trickier is a lot of those things are usually tech sponsored, like by, you know, whatever the governing organization for tech is. Let's say a CTO or a guild or whatever, right? So they have some space. In this cases, you're talking about like a business owner, product manager, somebody in HR, like having like to negotiate this, right? Like I got to negotiate this like non-functional requirement. So I think it talks about, you know, kind of data product ownership as like a new role. It's not, it's like a big thing to think about, that like people are gonna, product managers got to start putting on like a kind of like data hat. And I'm not just saying analytics, I'm saying in general, like the data I produce has got to be like really useful. Like it's something, I want to product manage this just like any other thing that I'm building, right? It's a big concept. And I think like if organizations don't grok that, they're doomed like in doing this sort of a thing, right?
Well, I think Zhamak kind of assumes, right, that look, we create these data domains because there are demands, agility, lots of different things to be done. But if you apply that business model to it, then yeah, and I think she says this, volume is one measure of success. So yeah, you know, avoid the data swamp, but that does imply, you know, that customer relationship. You may not know what is most useful for the business, but you've got an obligation to try and provide it once they define it, and you have the capability to do it. But so I like that idea of the agility, is that, you know, it's a lot of demand on an organization to say, yeah, you're a data producer now, and we're going to tell you what we think we need that's the most valuable. Whereas in breaking down silos, all we were asking them to do was share your data so other people can figure out where the value might be, you know.
How do you see the agility in this domain? Do you see it's really implementable? Do you see that?
No, not tables. So I would see that I think that, to my mind, and Lynn, I'm really interested in the paradigm you're presenting, which means, in a sense, that for I go on to that, is this idea that, yeah, we're all thinking really small relative to. I mean, it's almost when, you know, when big data came on the scene, it's like technology just can't handle it. What are we going to do? And yeah, so the examples here that we've got tend to be, you know, like the Duff example, or Spotify, or whatever it is. You can say, okay, small data domain. So back to that, to the question you asked, from my point of view, it's like there are some data domains that are going to align very well with some tools and not others. And so, yeah, to your point, yeah, there's going to be some things where, yeah, maybe SQL's the right fit. I share the point of view that it's hard to see how SQL scales, so, which is why we have this amazing brand new tools popping up in the last 10 years. But so I don't think it's as simple as, yeah, they're creating better tables. If that was the question you were asking, I may have misinterpreted.
I think one way of thinking about it is what I call like the data is the tailpipe problem, right? That most of the, you know, like let's narrow this to analytic concerns. Maybe that's why she makes this point early in the book.
No,
all the systems break because systems create bad data and then they change it on you, right?
Yeah.
And like they don't think about it all. Like, oh, here you need like sales data. Like, yeah, like look at this thing, whatever. I'll pull up the curtain, come grab the data, and then they'll make changes, and then it'll break, and you know, it might not have all the data, you know, the attributes you need and the connectivity that you need to other data sets, right? So like, yeah, I think about it that way, you know, as in they're providing that stewardship of the production of data, like that it's not just like data isn't a tailpipe, it's like important, right? They own the data and it's important.
My question for the agility is whole lot of concept right now. What she's presenting here is, does it go to typically to the decentralization? That's what comes in, or we can break it down more. How would I perceive the idea of agility here? in the whole data mesh? Do you see any scope of it? Because if we see this thing implemented towards the breaking down of the process, probably it would be a lot easier to implement it. When we see a big zone, we know this is the current scenario, we want to achieve it, but the process comes down in a different way. Do you see that way? My question is this: do you see the agility in, towards the decentralization from a centralized form?
Here's my thought on the agility in some ways, right? So one premise for the data warehouse, right, was you never deleted. You just add new records that were more up to date than the old ones you had, and if you preserve that historical context, it sort of gave the promise that later you could figure out a question that was more meaningful that you could have answered if you had aggregated all the data. So let's say premise is, yeah, we've got vast amounts of raw data, and maybe each domain has this vastness as well. But then the agility is really around, to what degree can that unit produce something of value because they understand all the pieces that are available to them, to the business demand, saying, we need this kind of a thing, and you're the owner of that realm. So how quickly can you build this new product for us?
Versus waiting for a central team.
Well, yeah, this is an essential team. Here's another thing to think about. Aren't we just talking about, in some cases, yeah, we've got these experts on these many things, and they tend to congregate together because they're experts in it technically, right? And then so what we're really proposing in some of these data domains is just the old idea of, oh yeah, we've got dotted lines based on projects, you know? So 'cause I think that's the one you raised too, right? HR. So they just need a couple people to be able to do this, the developers, they work with HR, and then they move on to the next one.
Well, in this way, what Matt is just thinking of course, governance is easy, workload would be split up, and the owners have their responsibilities. It's not bulk of responsibility on any one team, and they're jumbled of what to send into what, and then the time problem, and of course resources are not available in that way, which I understand. That is when we talk about the ground level of this thing, it's like we are splitting into the small portions. We are owning that, the way it's been said, that data as product. Then probably this would be the best example in keeping data. When I'm just saying one HR data is here, there is one owner, and that owner would supply any of the information needed from HR side. So governance is easy, and maintenance is easy. You can do many things when it is just under one straight line, defined domain.
Yeah.
That's true. When we have bulk, and I'm saying like I have big ones, and I'm giving access to all like 4 or 5 sections of my organization, then it is going majorly towards the governance, and then overloading onto the performance. Then we are not, maybe we are just maintaining a big lake, but we are not performing well. So it would be taking much more time to present. Probably I would not be giving responses to my team. What is being needed probably today, I might take a day or 2, because it is consuming a lot more. So if this idea can be implemented, it is again a lot more questions, and obviously we know, just not challenges. People will be rebellious on it, of course, because everything is suggesting is going back to the traditional way. It's just take your own data and work on your own. It's more like that.
So I have a couple ideas on how this can be made practical. I always try to, this is all great to think of up here, but how do I make it work today? And why is it any valuable? And where it kind of hit me was the problem with data swamps and all this other stuff is we wanted people to unsilo their data, throw it all together. Well, I'm sorry, if you go look at the financial system, let's take a relational model because that's what I'm used to. Those tables are so heavily normalized, and there's codes and criteria and acronym stuff built into that model that only the finance people know. And the idea was throw everything into the data lake, whatever. This is before, you know, you've cleaned it. But the idea was throw it in there, put some governance on top of it, and release it. And whoever needs it can go grab it, right? And I need a Power BI report that I need to look at payroll for, you know, past employees and look at retired, whatever. I don't understand their model, and their model is way too complex. And the idea, I mean, there were lots of ideas that you would create a business layer on top of that. I don't know if that's ever worked. It takes so much work. I've never seen anyone practically do it. And then when you do it and you create a data catalog, no one ever uses it. But that was that one issue. And so,
great example, by the way.
Yeah, and then so I'm taking it back to my software world. You've got the mainframe, you've got the small databases. I've got a finance app, I've got an HR app, I've got you know, another cool app for a business. Well, none of them talk to each other. How come I got to create a user account in 5 different systems? Why can't you let me query your system for a user and put it over here? How come when a user gets terminated or whatever, your hand click? No. So what did we do? We figured out these are all too tightly coupled. It was too brittle. You do an upgrade on one machine, it destroys half the pipeline. And so we started creating APIs. Well, in my mind, what is an API? You are delivering a product. Now, I'm not giving you carte blanche access to my entire system, all of those microservices, all of those subscriptions. You know, if we're an event-driven, I'm not giving you access to all those topics. I am giving you access to just the few different operations that you need, right? Yeah. And so I may have tons of code and tons of internal operations, but if you need to query accounts, create accounts, delete accounts, and upgrade accounts, I'm giving you some API endpoints for just accounts, right? And then that's my product. I guarantee you, if you use my API, it will always work. I'm testing everything. Now, if I go and change my schema, it's up to me to make sure the contract with the API still works. If I'm creating new features, I don't update the current API. I create a version 2, right? Or a version 3. And I might say version 1 is going to go end of life. Sorry, we're really making things into spaghetti just to keep version 1 running, which was depreciated 5 years ago. You need to stop using that, whatever. But my contract is the API. So from a data point of view, I'm now thinking, okay, how do we make this practical? I'm not asking HR or fiscal to suddenly own this gargantuan product of, you know, 50 tables, you know, millions of records. Now you've got to apply data ownership and governance and quality on top of that. Because you're right, you're never going to have that. You're going to negotiate, hire more staff. If I'm saying the finance team simply needs to know what's the first name, last name, address, whatever, start date, end date of current hirees, maybe past, just give me that. Now, I don't know what it looks like in a data mesh. Is that an API? Is that some other consumable endpoint? But at that point, can we say HR or fiscal or whatever, it's up to you to figure out how to provide this. That is now your product. You make sure it works. Everything else we don't care about. And then when your finance team, your sales team, or someone else comes and says, oh, HR, we also need this other, you know, we have a licensing criteria. We send people to training. Can you add training to that? That's a new product that they would go then create. So that's where I'm seeing this. The swamp kind of threw the onus on the data producers to share everything and be 100% accountable to everything, and no one could make use of it because it was just too much and they didn't have the context. So I'm starting to see these little niches, and she talks about that later in the book. I don't mean to talk so long, we're out of time, but that's where I see this going. I don't need to release everything, but I need to release just what is being asked for.
So really great discussion. So the big thing that sorry for the background, big thing that I'm thinking from today, again, is how is this different than a data mart? But Matt, thank you very much for reminding me, how is this different from an API? because I think
Oh,
those
yeah.
are big questions. So two things. We're going to meet next week. Hopefully everybody can meet next week. I know we were doing every other, but we missed the previous week. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I shouldn't do a little demo of of security. Because number one, it's going to force me to learn it. And
I can help you out with security.
yeah, on GCP Dataplex, because I think that
Oh,
you're gonna start to see the difference between object level security and area level security, which is one of the key features in the vendor products that I think will provide good value. So I will volunteer to do that for like 10, 15 minutes. I feel like we didn't finish this chapter, so I don't want to put you on the spot, Norman, but do you want to just keep going? Because
I'll keep going. I have a question I want everybody to think about for next time. So we talked about API. We talked about, is this different from data lake, monolithic? Here's another model to think about. How is this different from just having a lot of people doing software as a service?